So along with dignity and respect, justice is probably one of the most important values that when we feel it's been violated by another individual, by the state, by an organization, we do what we can to get fairness and to restore that violation. We have set up a justice system, and when it comes to crime, a criminal justice system with police, with prosecution, courts, prisons, to make sure that when that value of justice is violated, that we punish those that violated that value, and that we get what we need to get back to feel that that value has been restored. Now, a few decades ago, people started to ask, is this system that we have set up, this criminal justice system, fit for purpose? Is it actually giving me, as a victim or as an offender or as a professional that is serving that system, the sense that when this value of justice has been violated, has been restored? And we see all these rates of imprisonment going up, all these rates of people who go to prison, going back to prison, going up, the costs of imprisonment going up, and then crime and antisocial behavior still going up. So people have started to ask, and not just in one country, in the UK, for example, where we are based, but around the world. So 5 decades ago, those questions were posed, and just people, practitioners, just all victims or offenders, just started doing things differently. And they started calling this new approach or alternative approach restorative justice, restoring justice. And since then, there's been 5 decades, people started writing about restorative justice, doing restorative justice, implementing legislations on restorative justice. And most of the times, victims and offenders, and probably you watching this video, do not really know what restorative justice is. What is it? What does it have as a practice, as a system, as a concept? What is its main ingredient that is so different or better or worse than what we are experiencing in the criminal justice system or the justice system that I should be supporting or taking part of or know more about? So there's plenty of definitions out there, and this webinar is part of an RJ webinar series that tries to educate people, but also professionals and experts on specific topics on restorative justice. It comes under the banner of the RJ4All Institute that I set up and direct. But it doesn't champion restorative justice. It doesn't, this series and my institute just is not a campaigner for restorative justice. It's an investigator of restorative justice, but also a researcher of restorative justice and an implementation, if you like, partner of restorative justice through different mechanisms and practices, especially in the prevention area. And the 10th episode of Restorative Justice webinar series has a special guest who personally I have read and followed for many years and has been almost like a mentor. And as I said, I don't always find restorative justice to be a positive approach to something. In fact, if it's not done properly, I see it to be quite a risky endeavor, and I have respected this guest's writings and approach to restorative justice, which is objective, critical, and always looking at it from a positive angle, and an angle that would investigate the positive but also the disadvantages of not just restorative justice but of justice more generally. So it's a real pleasure to introduce the guest speaker for the 10th episode, Professor Gerry Johnstone. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, please do. And if you like these webinars, do subscribe to our channel, the RJ4All YouTube channel, and also press the bell button at the bottom so that you get notifications every time we have a new episode from this RJ webinar series, or just any episode, any video coming out of RJ4All International Institute. So welcome to the 10th episode, And over to Gerry now.
Welcome to the 10th episode of the RJ webinar series with our special guest, Professor Gerry Johnstone. Gerry, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us how did you get to know restorative justice? How long ago was that?
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this. So I've got a long-standing interest as an academic. I work as a professor of law at the University of Hull. And going right back to throughout my career as an academic, I've always been interested in issues of punishment, justice and control. And I think what has probably drawn me to these issues is a deeper interest in the practice of moral responsibility. It seems an essential but deeply problematic idea in our societies, and I thought, punishment, justice, and control are really good topics to explore this deeper interest through. So, going right back into the 1980s and 1990s, I had worked, developed this interest through my PhD work initially, and then subsequently a book on medical concepts and penal policy, exploring therapeutic interventions in criminal justice. And I had completed that project, and this was around towards the end of the 1990s, looking for something where I could continue that interest. So looking for the next project, but one that would build upon what I'd previously been working on. And at the time, I was also very interested in issues of democratization. With my background is in law and politics, and I was sort of interested in the concept of democracy and the practice of democracy. And one puzzle I'd had was that a lot of people were pushing for deeper democracy and for more democracy in all sorts of arenas. People looking for deeper democracy, moving beyond representative democracy to more participatory democracy in our lives. People wanted to take part in controlling their lives, in making decisions that affected them, in communities, in workplaces, and throughout society. But always seemed to stop short of criminal justice. That there seemed to be a notion around that issues of criminal justice were too dangerous to allow ordinary people to interfere in them. That if you allowed people to get involved in decision making around criminal justice, that they would do some pretty nasty and irrational things. So I was intrigued by this idea about why we would think that, and whether indeed those concerns had any grounding. And I was looking for projects. I always like to look for a particular practical project to explore these the deeper theoretical ideas. And I was doing a search for anything that was happening that involved communities and ordinary people in decision making and participation in criminal justice. And the term restorative justice kept cropping up. And this was also around a time in the late 1990s when the New Labour Party, which had just come into government, was one of their big ideas was about democratization and criminal justice. So I thought, that this had interest as a more promising way of involving people in making decisions that affected them quite deeply, like in response to crime. And I started looking at restorative justice to see, well, where did this idea come from, and what was happening with it, and what kind of effects it was having. And from there, my interest in restorative justice took off.
No, thank you for that. And I think it's very important for people who don't know much about, the recent history of restorative justice, how it developed over the last few decades, in the last 4 or 5 decades. And I think the key word for me from what you said is the word democracy, and what restorative justice as a concept, but also as a practice, whether it's mediation or conferencing or circles, is trying to do with ordinary people, people who we're calling offenders or victims who come into some sort of conflict, and just give them those tools to become part of the justice process, which is what I think democracy is all about. And I think that takes me to the topic of this webinars, which we're calling the campaign for restorative justice, and I would like to understand a bit more what you mean by the word campaign. And for me, when I think of a campaign, kind of very visual, I just see people walking down the street campaigning for a cause, or something that they're really passionate about. They get a banner or a flag and wave it, to get something fixed or to promote something. So what do you mean by the campaign for restorative justice, and do you consider yourself to be a campaigner for restorative justice?
Yeah, I'll bracket off the second question there for the moment about my own stance, like on the campaign. I would like to come back to that though, yeah. So in order to explain what I mean by the campaign for restorative justice, I would say just hold on to that image you have, of people walking down the street passionate about something, pushing for it, and then imagine, not this actually taking place in a street, but globally, internationally, in all sorts of arenas, because this is precisely, what's happening all over the world, in hundreds of countries now. You've got people who are tied together by a common interest in promoting restorative justice. So this global campaign that took off in the 1970s initially, but really gathered pace in the last 2 or 3 decades, and that's had huge influence, in all sorts of arenas. So the campaign for restorative justice, it's held together by what holds it together are some core goals and some core ideas. And the goals, quite simply, there's a negative goal and a positive goal. The negative one is to push the practice of punishment to the margins of social life, which is a very radical goal if you think that most people would regard punishment as a universal and an indispensable social practice. However much we're troubled by the institution of punishment, the idea that society could exist without punishments as a way of maintaining social order would strike many as absurd and very idealistic. But the restorative justice seeks to push punishment to the margins of social life, but it's also accompanied by a positive goal, which is to replace punishment to the greatest extent possible by what it calls restorative justice. There's been, I've written about the different interpretations of what is meant by restorative justice amongst those who campaigned for it within the social movement for restorative justice. But I think we could talk about those differences in due course. But what is probably more important is what actually holds people together. And I think the campaign is held together by a number of positions that it believes in. One is that there is an alternative to punishment, namely restorative justice. So an alternative does exist. Also important is the claim that this alternative can deliver everything that we expect to come from punishment. It can deliver crime control. It can deliver an experience of justice. It can deliver a sense of solidarity with victims, and it can provide a means of resolving conflicts. A third claim is that, which is really important, is that elements of this alternative already exist. I think it's essential. Proponents of restorative justice argue that we're not inventing something new and newfangled. We're not saying reject the old and bring in something completely new and untested. They say restorative justice it existed in the past, it exists today in indigenous society, amongst indigenous peoples in many societies, and it exists in our own society, in our everyday life, so that we resolve many issues through restorative justice without actually calling that. So the campaign for restorative justice is about reviving an everyday practice rather than campaigning for something completely new. A really important part of the campaign is its involvement with research. proponents of restorative justice have always invited researchers to come and evaluate what they're doing and to demonstrate that restorative justice does in fact work. And you yourself have been involved in many research projects along those lines. And I think also we'd miss something very important in understanding the campaign for restorative justice if we didn't recognise that what proponents of restorative justice often claim is that the campaign is held together by very progressive social values. We've already talked about democracy and empowerment as some of the values, but also proponents of restorative justice argues that it shows more respect for everybody involved in a situation of crime, that it's held together by values of common concern. So some call it justice, a more loving justice, a form of justice that enables us to do justice with love, with forgiveness, with mercy, and so on.
Yeah, and I'm not forgetting the second part of my question, by the way, because I still want to know, on a personal note, whether you are a campaigner for restorative justice. Because as you said, where I would often come from is from the kind of the research point of view, the evaluator's point of view, and ask the questions, and not just questions about does it work, it's also how does it work, and if it works, and there's so many other questions within the what works, is who is involved, and all the things about this empowerment that you mentioned. So I'll come back to that probably towards the end, to see whether you consider yourself to be a campaigner for restorative justice. But one of the questions I had as you were talking is, because there's a lot of rhetoric about restorative justice, there's probably a lot of literature now, and probably one of the most thorough literatures in criminology is on restorative justice. What is the goals of your research around this campaigning, the campaign for restorative justice? And I can see there are little small campaigns that you outlined within this larger campaign of restorative justice, whether it's around punishment or the different things that you articulated. But what are the what is the ultimate goal? What are you trying to test or achieve?
Yeah. So I've pursued various goals, like throughout the whole range of writing and research projects I've done around restorative justice. Probably the first book I published on restorative justice had the subtitle Ideas, Values, Debates, and that probably encapsulates everything that I'm really interested in. I think I'm interested in the ideas that underpin restorative justice, and the ideas that it tries to persuade us, are the right ideas, the right ways, the ways of thinking, if you like. I'm interested in the values that underpin restorative justice, and again, that the campaign for restorative justice says, we ought to embrace these values more deeply. But also, if you do embrace these values, these are the sorts of practices that you should also embrace. And I'm interested in debates, both internally within the campaign for restorative justice, which all sorts of debates, from very pragmatic ones, very practical debates about what's the best way to proceed, to what does restorative justice really mean, right up to debates between the campaign and others who the campaign might be trying to persuade. The debates with, and there are all sorts, from people who are hostile and critical towards restorative justice, towards policy makers who might say, look, this is interesting, but I want to hear more about it. I've got these concerns, how would it fit in? So I've been very interested in exploring those debates. But I also, in the work that I'm doing at the moment, and I've been working on this for a long time, so I'm trying to, in some ways, pull everything together into one kind of piece of work, is to do, I think, three basic things. One is that restorative justice has this aspiration to change the way in which we think about and do justice in the aftermath of crime and other troublesome behaviour in society, and I want to explain that aspiration. explain its nature. That may seem straightforward, but I'm obviously presuming it's not as straightforward as it might seem when we look first of it. Secondly, and this will again relate to the question about my own stance on this, I want to really ask about the desirability of the changes that the restorative justice campaign, the restorative justice movement seeks to bring about. To pose the question very seriously, if this campaign does succeed, will the results be better or worse? And will they be better or worse in what ways? I want to look at that question, asking, does the idea of restorative justice have the moral force which its proponents and campaigners presume and argue that it does have? And third, and for me this is really important, is that I want to do all of this in a way that communicates it to as wide a readership as possible. One of the things I've always took pride in is the way in which my work has reached a wide readership, but I want it to be even wider still. Like I think I can detect a tendency for the debate about restorative justice to become more and more an internal debate amongst those who are already adherents to the idea. It's for all sorts of reasons. I think that's the idea has enough interest to to be the impetus for a very wide-ranging sort of conversation amongst all sorts of people, ordinary members of the public who are interested, policymakers, and I want to write a work about restorative justice that will explain all of this in a way that appeals to a very broad readership.
That's great, and it resonates. Obviously, I mean, this is one of the reasons we're doing these webinars, and the RJ4All, Restorative Justice for All kind of brand. It's good to hear you being hopeful that restorative justice can have access to just people who are not experts in this area, and I think that's one of the things that restorative justice has been criticized for, because victims, offenders don't know about it. And I wanted to challenge you a little bit about what you said in relation to if restorative justice was to succeed in its campaign, or its campaigners got what they wanted at some point in their lives. And I would just probably use the example of England and Wales, because people are watching from different places of the world. But as you know, we recently had a change in our criminal justice legislation to introduce restorative justice at different stages of the criminal justice system, whether it's the courts being able to divert the case, or within the prison system, or even police just diverting cases, and the CPS. And that's been, I would consider that to be a major success of the campaigners of restorative justice. It's been around, this change in legislation for some time. And in fact, the government had an evaluation of the pathfinders and how the courts were using this opportunity through legislation, and the evaluation was not that good, which people like me would like to question and research the implementation of restorative justice. Thought, do you know what, I'm not surprised. And I wasn't surprised, because it was provided through certain routes, and those routes were within the criminal justice system in a specific way, and using the criminal justice system institutions, whether the courts or the police or the prosecution and so on. And as a result, as you know, we had an inquiry in Parliament, and Parliament was asking, why did we spend all this money on restorative justice when we didn't even get half of the numbers for reduction on reoffending or for victim satisfaction? And they said, maybe we just need a bit more evidence before their campaign is further supported. So I would just, just plain devil's advocate here and say, so is this campaign about making the name of restorative justice louder and more accessible to victims, or is it actually something else, which is to look at how restorative justice is actually being provided on the ground, and how, independently of where you are in, the criminal justice system of this world, we are meant to be providing restorative justice?
Yeah. I want to be a little bit cautious, in how I respond to that, because some of the things I've got certain ideas about the development of restorative justice, and if you sort of in their raw form, like that they can actually result in misinterpretation and confusion. Like so, I want to make it clear about as much as I can about what I'm not saying, as much as about what I was saying in response to that. But I just think, I think it's really necessary to go back, again to and this is hence my interest in the campaign for restorative justice and going right back, like sort of what are the ambitions, what are the aspirations, what is the idea of restorative justice essentially about, like sort of and ask the kind of questions I'm interested in are clearly there is a vision of social change, of radical social change within the restorative justice movement from the very beginning, and so if I'm evaluating restorative justice, I'm not really kind of thinking about looking at this practice and saying, does it produce greater crime control? I'm not saying that those questions are unimportant, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm much more interested in, whether this kind of, these deep social changes, which one is trying to bring about through the idea of restorative justice, are feasible, whether they're desirable, what the consequences would be, so on. So I'd probably start off, with a very kind of different viewpoint and a very different set of questions than most of the kind of research that we've been talking about. But I kind of, if you've got an aspiration to bring about social change, you have to start somewhere, and I can completely understand. People saying, well, we've got the opportunity. We can't just sit around talking about restorative justice forever. Like, we've got to practice it. We've got to be able to demonstrate that it works, and therefore we've got to kind of try to push, really implement practices of restorative justice. And a lot of people, although restorative justice involves a critique of the criminal justice system. One of the other things is many of this most enthusiastic advocates are actually people working within the criminal justice system. And you can say, well, we've got an opportunity to set up a program, like, within a probation service. We've got the opportunity to set up this or that, sort of practice this or that program. And if we can do this, we're making progress because the practice of restorative justice is proliferating. We're getting, if we measure the success of the restorative justice campaign in terms of, how many programs are being run, how many people are taking part, you can say, well, it's been really successful. We've got all of the, look at all this activity that has taken place around the concept of restorative justice, and we've got the opportunity to test it. And it's very easy to finesse the kind of the outcomes of research into this, to say, well, look at all the success we've had in these practices, and to the extent that we haven't had success, that's because there's been something non-ideal about the situation or the context in which the practices are working. So it's I think there is an issue of this drive, like a very understandable drive, to push forward the practice of restorative justice. But at the same time, when people are doing that, so sometimes I think there's a forgetting that takes place. You're forgetting about what the campaign was actually meant to be achieving, in the first place. I'm not saying you always have to go back to your original goals and stick to them, kind of, things kind of that. But it's important to hold on to what the ambitions were, what the scale of the ambitions were. So I think there's been a narrowing of the ambition of the campaign for restorative justice, and also, just getting involved in. I mean, of course, nobody would think that you can do something like restorative justice without making compromises. The minute you actually try to implement a practice in the real world, you're involved in negotiations and compromises with all sorts of people. I mean, I've had this in projects that I've worked on myself, where we did a recent project about using a form of restorative justice in prisons throughout Europe. And once you start doing this, well, you've got to you need the cooperation of so many people, like, who are not necessarily committed to the goal of restorative justice, and that changes and dilutes what you're doing. So I'm not, of course, compromises are necessary, but I think there's been maybe, I think you've partly kind of hinted at this, like, sort of a willingness to close one's eyes, to the dangers of sort of, being so keen to get a practice of restorative justice that you fail to forget about the context in which you're setting up that practice, the power relations that surround it, and all that's involved. And then if you begin to start calling those practices, and I think this is the real nux of the problem for me, when you start calling those practices restorative justice, you say, this is the model, we've got it, this is what restorative justice essentially is. It's this practice of victim-offender encounters that take place like within this certain context, that you're actually distorting those original ideas, like, and you're kind of, sort of pegging everything on the success or failure of those particular practices. So what I would say is, I don't see, maybe because I'm not a practitioner, like, I mean, in that sense, and I'm not sort of that keen. I don't really care, like, whether we have a kind of sort of 200 new programs in the next year. I'm much more interested in the much deeper social ambitions, the much deeper moral ambitions behind the campaign for restorative justice. And I'm interested in asking how much progress has been made in sort of transforming society in line with those ideas. And there, I think, sort of, you would have to say that the achievements of the campaign for restorative justice have been much more modest than if you measure it simply in terms of practice. I don't know how much that sense.
No, absolutely, and I think there's value both in their doing, but also their theorizing, and without the two, I think you can't have new pieces of legislation or progress in any field, including justice. My question would be, okay, so if we are looking at this as as a social change issue, not just as a justice or criminal justice issue, then in reality, what does this look like? So, if we're looking at this campaigning for restorative justice from a kind of social change perspective, social movement perspective, and you can use one country or one location, or completely up to you. What does that look like? Because I'm struggling to see it from a kind of, even from a theoretical perspective. How does it articulate in our everyday lives? What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could. I mean, that's, I suppose, I mean, restorative justice in our everyday lives, like, I mean, could take so many different forms, like, and I think, that's, I'd resist the urge to kind of say, that you can point to any single practice, like whether it's a formally developed practice, like various restorative conferencing schemes, or whether it's a kind of sort of a type of encounter that takes place in our everyday lives, and say, look, this is what restorative justice is. I think, and again, when I mentioned earlier, I said, the themes are ideas, values, and debates. I think we have to go back to ideas, and I don't want to. I've always resisted the urge to kind of say, look, I've got the idea of restorative justice, and this is the one true way of thinking about it, and everybody should coalesce around that. The most I would ever say is, look, these are important ideas that people in the field, some people in the field have been talking about, the pioneers of the field have been talking about, and that we're in danger. There's always a danger of losing sight of these ideas and ideals. And for me, what one of the most important ideas is to start off by saying, everyone can agree, in a society, that justice is an important value. We don't have to be proponents of restorative justice. I mean, I think this is, I mean, also kind of moving into the best way to develop restorative justice here, like, to get common ground with those who don't necessarily buy into certain practices or particular claims that the restorative justice movement makes. So everybody agrees that justice is important. We can attach different. Even there, we can attach different value to justice, and might say justice is the supreme value. Others might say, well, justice is a very important value, but also one to be balanced against other things that we regard as important. But however that pans out, I mean, that's a conversation to be had, like about the actual relative value of justice compared with other values. But if we agree that justice is a value, and we also agree that in situations where somebody does, through a wrongful action, again, what counts as a wrongful action is always going to be a matter of debate, but through a wrongful action causes harm to another person or group. And I would emphasize the wrongfulness rather than, some people say we should just talk about harms. I think it's wrongful harm doing is what the target here is, that does create a need for justice, a desire for justice. And I think the kind of conversation I would like to see, and this is why I'm interested in restorative justice, because it prompts this kind of conversation, is, okay, so we all agree that justice, we should strive for justice in this situation. But now, what do we mean by justice? And how can we know, when we've achieved it? And what I think is interesting about restorative justice is it has a distinctive answer to that question. It's saying that justice is not necessarily achieved when we inflict reciprocal suffering upon the perpetrator of a wrongful harm. And you don't even have to say that infliction of reciprocal suffering is not a necessary or essential agreement. You say it's not sufficient. So although it may deliver a transient, fleeting experience of justice, a lot of people say, well, I still feel something is missing. I still feel an emptiness after this has happened. Like, we want something more, and that something more is repair of all of the harm that has resulted from this action. And arguably, I mean, for some, not only the harm that's resulted from the action, but all the harm that's revealed by that action. And what we should be striving for when we're striving for justice is this repair in this wider sense, and that's repair of material harm, social harm, relational harm, and so on. And once you start thinking about the goal of restorative justice in those terms, you have to sort of question whether some of the practices that have been labelled as restorative justice are necessarily sort of tracking that goal, or whether they've been diverted towards the goals of their sponsors and agencies, which may be very different. And that's not to say practices of restorative justice. You can also say that they have many other kind of potentially many other benefits. They can maybe produce a longer lasting kind of pacification, and in the face of conflict, there's all sorts of benefits that might come from restorative justice. But if we leave out that notion, that very different conception of what the justice is that we're striving for, then we're missing something very important. I've actually forgotten your original question now, so I don't know. I've lost track of it in my answer. Yeah.
In fact, I've got two more questions. I'm conscious of time. Now, go back to the question of what were your goals, when you started studying this campaign for restorative justice. And I've always been very impressed, with the detail of your arguments in your writings, and how you also find the significance in that detail. And I've always been convinced by the argument that you do need to look at the detail, even in kind of the normative detail concepts that then break down, this wider concept of restorative justice. So I understand that part of your answer of, we need to group together all these different smaller campaigns, articulate them, understand them, if we want to go forward and analyze them and have a debate about these ideas, these values, underpinning restorative justice. The question I have, because again, I'm just going back to that image of just walking down the street and campaigning for something to change. And you said before, and I wasn't clear, because you said at the beginning, restorative justice started with these ambitions. And we know that there was the wave of abolitionism at the time, the 70s. People were questioning how the criminal justice system and its effectiveness, and they were coming up with these alternatives. And there was quite strong views about getting rid of prisons and, replacing them with something else. And then you said that kind of is now watered down, and that is not so much happening, as, it's not that extreme, and it's kind of blending in, and it's been reduced to something else. And that's when I think of campaigning. That's the thing that I'm thinking about. So just going back to my question, is this part of your study? Is this part of your goal to make the argument stronger, to go back to an abolitionist conversation and attach that label onto restorative justice? And is it about campaigning for more for restorative justice without even going down the route of, like, is this working, is it not, is the practice as good? Is that what your study also about?
Just one I think nuance on that, because one of the things I'm doing in my current work is trying to look at the sources of the campaign for restorative justice, and certainly abolitionism is one of those sources. Not just prison abolitionism, but actually penal abolitionism. I was very influenced early by people like Luke Holzman, who is often thought of as a prison abolitionist, but his actual agenda was much more radical than that. So he wanted to question about whether or not we should be using concepts such as crime at all, and so on. But there's also there's a whole what I'm actually picking up. I mean, I'm just going back through and looking for the campaign for restorative justice emerged from a very diverse variety of sources, which coalesced and came together at a certain point. So some of them had nothing to do with justice at all, like just from the community movements. I think restorative justice has some roots in things like community credit unions, and just movements that sought to give more power, to have communities take back power from experts. Right down at the other end of this, seeing ideas of restitution, like within the justice system, civilizing conflicts, interest from the victims movement, interest in indigenous peacemaking. There were a whole range of things came together, and hence that's why I think when all of these groups come together and they coalesce around the idea of restorative justice, I think it would be mistaken to think that there is some central coherent idea, like restorative justice is there. I think it's a bit more vague than that. But in terms of my own kind of approach, just by temperament, I am just not. I'm not the flag waver. I'm not an evangelicus. I mean that may be just as much a matter of personal temperament as everything else. In my youth I took part in a few marches, but I was never quite comfortable like in that. Maybe because of the kind of I think probably the sense of commitment to a single cause. You have to blind yourselves to an awful lot in order to take part in that. So lots of sympathy for various kind of people who take part in those kind of campaigns, but I also tend to keep, I think, more of a sort of detached kind of view. Things. The most I'd be prepared to sort of say is that I think, so it's not just a matter of personal temperament either. Like, I do think my stance towards restorative justice is one which would say that this is interesting enough, right? And there's enough interest in this to make it worth exploring and looking into and examining in depth and pushing forward like this. So I think the issues that the restorative justice campaign are attempting to address, are far too complex, to be able to take a very simplistic, yes, I'm for this and I'm against that. I've studied enough of the the practice and philosophy of punishment, to know that the issues that it raises are very complex. We can't just any simplistic notion of abolition of a deep-rooted social practice is one that I think one needs to be a bit careful about. But I think so. My interest in restorative justice is because I think it's in a very problematic area of our social lives. It does have some very interesting things to say about how we could think better and how we could act better. And what I'm interested in doing in my work is exploring what that thinking better is and what that acting better is, and whether it really is better in all of those respects. I've been characterised by Howard Zur, who's been I think a great supporter of my work, like for which I'm really grateful. Often characterises me as a kind of sympathetic critic of the restorative justice movement. That my contribution to the development of restorative justice. There are different people. Some people are very practical and very energetic about pushing forwards, and that you need those people. I'm not one of them. Some people are sort of really good in the kind of sort of about pushing stuff forward in policy circles. Again, you need that. Again, that's I'm not one of those people. But one thing that is necessary is people to really look carefully and clearly at the goals, at the ideas, at the values, and to ask critical questions about them wherever they lead, and not be afraid. Just to say, well, look, this sounds very progressive. This is much more complicated than people have made it seem, and this idea I just think is a lot of nonsense. So I think that's the type of work and also try and look at the contradictions between different ideas within restorative justice. Look quite a lot at the contradictions between saying the goal ought to be repair of harm, and the goal ought to be to get a wide group of people participating in discussion of what justice means. There are tensions, at least, if not contradictions, between all those ideas. And I think I think definitely enough interest to be worth pursuing. I wouldn't call myself an advocate of restorative justice, and was sworn to stop short of being an advocate of everything that has been represented as restorative justice.
Yeah, and personally, you will know this. I'm relieved to hear that, and I think just from a kind of, we all interpret our worldviews based on our experiences and what sort of experiences we had, and my own experience has given me the position that I come from, which is a very cautious one, having seen restorative justice when it works really well, but sometimes it can go horribly wrong, and I've had those cases where it did go horribly wrong. And just to conclude this webinar, I wanted to ask you, do you think that this campaign has been successful so far? And if it hasn't been, what does success look like for you?
Well, I suppose, as I said earlier, one of the things that I would want to do is sort of actually reinvigorate, if not launch a conversation about that very question, about what success means, about I just don't think I certainly want to say that you cannot measure success in terms of the number of programs that are called restorative justice that are being practiced, about the number of cases that are being transferred to restorative justice. So, we need to actually have a more serious discussion, I think, about we've had restorative justice. The idea has been around now for a number of decades, and I think it's and there are lots of people actually doing this. I'm not the only voice, sort of saying, let's actually stand back a bit now. Now's the time to stand back and say, well, look, take stock of where we are now. What is it that we actually want to achieve? And I think that conversation is just an ongoing one. I don't think these kind of things, it's not something with a very concrete, specific goal that you say, right, okay, now we're 80% of the way there. Now we've achieved it. I think it's more of an impulse. A drive to think things differently and to act things differently, and one never knows which direction that is going to go on. So I just think I would want to pose the question more of one is how have the idea, those who are seeking to promote restorative justice, how have they developed the idea, and what kind of crucially, I think. If I was to focus on one issue that I would like to, I think ought to be focused on, and people ought to know more about, how, to what extent has the campaign for restorative justice succeeded in influencing everybody, so sort of not just policymakers, not just practitioners, but everybody to think, even not necessarily to think differently, but to think more, like, I mean, about how we respond to crime and troublesome behavior, how we act upon it, about the kind of policies that we think are right, the kind of practices that we think are right. So sort of, just to get how to what extent has restorative justice succeeded in promoting, deeper reflection upon issues of crime, justice, and control in our societies. And I think, if we started to take that as a measure, right, sort of, and that as a goal, I think you get a very different answer to the question about success.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, and thank you very much. I think this is it opens all sorts of other questions, and the Pandora box is like, now, especially now where we are experiencing, and I think we will be experiencing a lot of reforms and changes in our justice and the criminal justice system with COVID-19 and socioeconomic impacts, including the impacts that it's having on, how justice is delivered. I think these questions are important, and just looking at the history of campaigns, human rights campaigns, and so on. In my view, the most successful ones were the simple campaigns where people could sign up to them very easily, independently of location. They would get inspired by, Martin Luther King's speech, and then everything would just have a knock-on effect, and things would start changing with this social change that you were talking about. So for me, it's not so much whether we are a champion of restorative justice or of the pink elephants concept. For me, it's, success is what is this? What is the problem? Identify the problem. And then what is this simple idea, value that we all sign up to, whether it's called justice, fairness, equality, dignity, and respect? And what are these simple mechanisms that then we can all use to change what we have identified as being the problem? And that's I think where I think we're all going to be asking these questions very soon, as the criminal justice system or the justice system adjusts its mechanisms, its finances, its economics, its practices, and so on. So just to say a huge thank you for your time, for joining the webinars. I'm looking. Did you say you're going to publish this work? Is this going to be part of the book? Is it an article so that we can put in as a link?
Yeah, it's still a way off, and has been. My progress has been slowed down a bit, sort of by the current, sort of pandemic situation. But yeah, the aim is to complete a book. It's not a long book, sort of, which has the working title "The Social Movement for Restorative Justice." So I've got the book has been commissioned by Routledge, and the aim is to finish that within a year or so. And this will be the aim of the book is to explain the aspirations of restorative justice, to assess the desirability of it, and to write this in sort of in a way that will reach the widest possible readership.
Great, and you also mentioned the ideas, values, and debates, and we'll put a link under the video for people to access it. And would people be? Is it okay to send you an email, or how's it like the best way to pose questions or ideas about what was discussed?
Yeah, I'm always happy. You can put my email address. I'm always happy to receive email, and we'll always respond. Like, I mean, yes, it's sort of at least eventually. Like, sort of. But yeah, be very happy to hear any thoughts that anybody has.
Yeah, no, and just to say on a personal note, thank you for all this support and the help that you've given me over the how many years now? I've known you, at least 20 years probably. You've always been very gracious with your time and the advice. And so thank you for that, and also thank you for being part of the seminars.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure on both counts. Yeah, so a long friendship, as you say. So it's nice to do this. So thank you very much for inviting me.